They told the world that wealth was measured in gold, in land, in titles, in the weight of crowns and the reach of empires. But there were men who controlled more than kings and owned nothing, not a single acre, not a vault of treasure, not even the palaces they walked through. And yet, they decided who would rise, who would fall, who would eat, and who would starve. This is the story of the invisible oligarchs, the shadow emperors, the men who understood something the world had forgotten. True power is not in what you own, it's in what you control. And what they controlled was everything. To understand this, we need to go back, long before stock markets, before central banks, before the machinery of modern finance. For most of human history, wealth was physical, tangible, visible. A king was rich because he had land. A merchant was powerful because he had gold. A lord commanded respect because he owned castles, armies, livestock. Ownership was the currency of power. But somewhere in the shadows of medieval Europe, a quiet revolution began. Not with swords, not with conquest, but with a single dangerous idea. What if you didn't need to own something to profit from it? Enter the men who would never appear on any list of history's wealthiest. The men whose names were whispered in royal courts, but rarely written in gold tax farmers. Papal bankers, royal treasurers, contract holders. They owned nothing, but they controlled the flow. And in doing so, they became richer than the emperors they served. The breakthrough came in the form of a contract, a piece of parchment, a promise. It was called tax farming. Here's how it worked. A king needed money, wars to fight, palaces to build, courts to maintain. But collecting taxes, that was messy, slow, expensive. So the king made a deal. He sold the right knee to collect taxes to private financiers. These men would pay the crown a lump sum up front, then go collect the taxes themselves, keeping whatever they could squeeze out. The king got his gold immediately. The tax farmer got everything else. And here's the key. The tax farmer owned nothing. Not the land, not the people, not the throne. He simply held a contract, a license to extract. And that contract made him untouchable, because now the kingdom needed him. The crown had already spent the money. The wars were already declared. The debts were already due. The tax farmer became the middleman between the throne and survival. And middlemen, throughout history, have always been the richest men in the room. Case 1. The Publicani of Rome. Rome didn't invent tax farming, but it perfected it. In the late Roman Republic, a class of businessmen known as the Publicani controlled the entire taxation system of the empire. They owned no territory, they commanded no legions, but they collected the taxes of provinces, Gaul, Asia, Hispania, and pocketed the difference. Some became so wealthy that they financed entire military campaigns. They lent money to generals. They funded senators. They influenced elections. And when the republic fell and the empire rose, the emperors didn't dismantle the system. They absorbed it, because they too needed the Publicani. The emperor might wear the crown, but the Publicani held the purse strings. Case 2. The Papal Bankers of the Middle Ages. Fast forward to the 13th century. The Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in Europe, and it too needed money. So it turned to bankers, men like the Medici, the Fuggers, the Bardi families. These men didn't own the church. They didn't control doctrine, they weren't even ordained. But they controlled the finances of Christendom. They collected tithes across Europe. They financed crusades. They managed the Pope's treasury. And in return, they took a cut, a percentage A fee. And here's the irony. The church preached against usury, the sin of charging interest. But the bankers found a loophole. They didn't charge interest. They charged service fees, exchange rates, transaction costs, Different words, same result. The church condemned greed in public, but in private, it depended on the greediest men alive. Case 3. The French fermiers, généraux. Jump to 18th century France, the age of Louis XIV, the Sun King, Versailles, opulence beyond imagination. But who paid for it? Not the king. He was broke. The cost was borne by a shadowy group called the fermiers généraux, the general farmers. These men held a contract to collect all of France's indirect taxes, salt, tobacco, customs duties. They paid the crown a fixed amount up front, then extracted as much as they could from the population. They owned no land, no estates, no armies. But they became the most hated men in France. Because while the king lived in golden halls, the fermiers généraux were the ones squeezing peasants for the last copper coin. When the French Revolution came, the people didn't storm Versailles first. They hunted the tax farmers. 28 of them were guillotined in a single day. Case 4. The British East India Company. Now let's cross into the modern era, the British East India Company. It's often called a corporation, a trade monopoly, but that misses the point. The East India Company didn't just trade, it governed. By the mid-18th century, it controlled the entire subcontinent of India, not as owners, but as administrators, as tax collectors. The Mughal emperors still technically ruled, but the company held the diwani, the right to collect revenue. So the company owned nothing, but it extracted everything. It taxed farmers, it taxed merchants, it taxed entire provinces, and it sent the profits back to London. The directors of the company became some of the richest men in Britain, not through ownership, but through control. And when famines struck, when millions died, the company kept collecting, because the contract said so. Let's be clear about what this system was. It was elegant, efficient, legal, and it was brutal. Because when you own nothing, you bear no responsibility. The tax farmer didn't care if the harvest failed. The papal banker didn't care if the peasants starved. The company director didn't care if Bengal burned. They had a contract, a quota, a deadline. And if the people couldn't pay, that was the people's problem. This is the shadow side of financial abstraction. When power is separated from ownership, accountability disappears. The king could say, "I didn't do it." The tax farmer did. The Pope could say, "I didn't collect it, the bankers did." The British Parliament could say, "We didn't govern India, the company did." Everyone profits. No one is responsible. And the system rolls on. You might think this is ancient history, a relic of feudalism and colonialism. But look around. Who owns your debt? Not a person. A servicer. A faceless corporation that bought your loan from another corporation. Who controls global supply chains? Not governments. Logistics companies. Container firms. Middlemen who own nothing but control everything. Who profits from your data? Not you. Tech platforms. Ad networks. Aggregators who own no content but monetize all of it. The system has evolved, but the logic hasn't changed. The richest people today don't own factories. They own platforms. They don't own land. They own rights. They don't own products. They own access. Bezos doesn't own the goods on Amazon. He owns the marketplace. Zuckerberg doesn't own your photos. He owns the distribution. BlackRock doesn't own the companies. It owns the shares. And just like the tax farmers of Rome, the papal bankers of Florence, the fermiers généraux of Paris, they take a cut of everything, not because they own it, but because they control the flow. So here's the question that history whispers to us. Who holds that power today? Who are the modern publicani, the shadow oligarchs of the digital age? And more importantly, what happens when the people finally realize that the richest among us own nothing at all? History has a pattern. The tax farmers always get rich, the people always get angry, and eventually the contract gets torn up. Sometimes peacefully. Usually not. The French Revolution didn't start because the king owned too much. It started because the middlemen extracted too much. And today, we live in the age of extraction. The platforms take their cut. The algorithms take their cut. The financial system takes its cut. And we're told this is just how things work. But history says otherwise. History says that every system built on invisible control eventually becomes visible. And when it does, the people remember what power really is. Not ownership, not contracts, not platforms. Accountability. The richest people in history owned nothing, but they controlled everything, and in the end, that's what cost them. If this changed how you see the world, subscribe. This is Memories of Money, where history leaves its richest lessons, and history still holds the receipts.